Today we're going to read Don't Squeal Unless It's a Big Deal, A Tale of Tattletales. This book is by Jeanie, Franz, Ransom, and illustrated by Jackie Urbanovic. All right, and the illustrator is the one that draws the pictures, right? And so these are illustrations by an illustrator, and the author is Jeanie, Franz, Ransom. Okay, and so we're going to be hearing this story today. While we're listening to the story, we're going to see a lot of dialogue between characters. And we need to think about, too, who is telling the story, and as well, maybe the lesson we can learn. There were 19 students in Mrs. McNeil's class and 19 tattletales. We have 19 kids in our class, so that is a great connection to make with this story. It all started when Jessica trotted up to Miss McNeil's desk. "Peter pulled my pigtail." "That must have hurt," Mrs. McNeil said. "Did you tell Peter that?" Jessica nodded. Mrs. McNeil said, "Let's see what Peter has to say." Now in here, you can see these quotation marks, right? And this is a quote from Jessica, and here's a quote from Mrs. McNeil, right? And so we know that those are the characters that are talking. Peter dragged his hooves all the way up to Mrs. McNeil's desk. "Jessica says you pulled her pigtail," Mrs. McNeil said. "I did not," Peter said. "Yes, you did," Jessica said. "You both have the right to say how you feel," Mrs. McNeil said. "You also have the right to feel safe and comfortable at school. Rules like keep your hooves to yourself make it easier to do that." Mrs. McNeil added, "But since Jessica's tail is still attached, and Peter doesn't look particularly dangerous at the moment, I think it's safe to go back to your desks now." Jessica stomped. Peter snorted. Mrs. McNeil started humming "The Farmer in the Dell." Mrs. McNeil had just lifted her cup of slop for a quick slurp when Stephen trotted up. "Rachel took my pink marker, and she won't give it back. I even asked her 2 times. Mrs. McNeil put down her cup. "Stephen, I'm so glad you tried to fix the problem yourself. First, by talking to Rachel," she said. "Maybe your ears aren't working too well today. Let's find out." So do you think that Stephen is going to get his pink marker back? Or do you think that there's something else going on? "Stephen can't find his pink marker," Mrs. McNeil said. "Have you seen it?" "I gave it back," Rachel cried. "I can't find my pink marker." "That's because you used it all up," Peter said. "You're always drawing pictures of pigs." Rachel sniffed. "For your information, those are pictures of moi. What am I supposed to do? Color myself green?" "You know our class rule, Rachel," said Mrs. McNeil. "If you want to borrow something, ask first. It's how friends treat friends and stay friends." Mrs. McNeil had just taken her first sip of slop when Megan announced, "Frankie called Suki a fat sow." Those aren't nice words. Mrs. McNeil had to gulp her slop before she could speak. She cleared her throat and hoped she didn't have a corn kernel in her teeth. "I'm glad you know our class rules so well," Mrs. McNeil said. "You're right, we don't call each other names." "Also, we don't try to fix problems that don't belong to us," Mrs. McNeil said. "I know you're trying to help, but if Frankie and Suki have a problem, it's their job to fix it. If they can't, it's my job as a teacher to help them." "Your job," Mrs. McNeil added, "is to take care of you. That's the most important job you can have." Megan danced a jig all the way back to her desk. But then, what do you think the students are going to do now? The stampede started. "Jonathan ripped my paper. Robbie breathed on me. Emily called my desk a pigsty. Laura looked at me. Jeremy's grunting and I can't concentrate. Sam's picking his snout." This is a scene that looks very familiar to Mrs. Cumming. I wonder if it looks familiar to you. Maybe you have been one of these kids before. The students had practically worn a path to Mrs. McNeil's desk and worn out her patience. When she stood up, the students sat down. "Before we go to lunch, I think we need to add a new rule to our list," Mrs. McNeil said. "A very important rule," she added. "Can anyone tell me what squealing is?" Students started squealing like their tails were stuck in a gate. "Not that kind of squealing," Mrs. McNeil shouted, waving a cowbell. When the class was quiet, Mrs. McNeil continued. "Squealing," she said, "is my special word for tattling, and I know you know what that is." Some students looked at the floor. Some looked at each other. Some looked at the ceiling like they'd suddenly seen something interesting up there. Mrs. McNeil started writing on the board. "Here's our new class rule," Mrs. McNeil said. "What does it mean?" Jessica asked. "I'm glad you asked," Mrs. McNeil said. "To squeal on someone means you go tell a grown-up when someone does or says something you don't like, instead of telling that person first. Most problems that happen between kids are kid-sized problems. They can work out themselves," Mrs. McNeil said, "usually by talking, listening, and helping each other." The new class rule you can see up here, new class rule, don't squeal unless it's a big deal. So I think she's about to tell us what would be considered a big deal, right? Versus the kid-sized problems. "But sometimes," Mrs. McNeil said, "something happens that's bigger than a kid-sized problem, like when someone is hurt or in danger, or when a person is hurting you, or hurting a pet, or hurting something that doesn't belong to them or that belongs to all of us. That's when it's okay to squeal, because it's a big deal. When it's a big deal, it's an emergency. That's when you need to hoof it and get help from a grown-up." Oscar raised his hoof. "I know it's not a big deal, Mrs. McNeil, but I'm hungry enough to eat a haystack." Mrs. McNeil laughed. "Me too. I'm sure we'll get to practice what we've learned when we get back." But that afternoon, Mrs. McNeil had barely closed the classroom gate when Katie said, "Jeanie hogged the rope swing at recess." Mrs. McNeil pointed to the board. "Remember what we just learned?" Katie nodded. "Then you know you need to tell Jeanie first about the problem." "Tell me what?" Jeanie yelled from across the room. "That you were hogging the swing," Katie yelled back. "You never asked for a turn," Jeanie said. "I didn't get a turn," Jeremy said. "It's not my fault," Peter said. "Not this time. It's Caroline's fault." Suki said. "Who's Caroline?" Oscar asked. "She's not even in our class," Frankie said. Thump. Mrs. McNeil had disappeared. "Are you okay?" Megan asked. Mrs. McNeil didn't answer. Her eyes were closed. Her tail was limp. One ear had something red on it. "Quick! Call the office! Tell them it's an emergency! Somebody get the nurse! Somebody tell Mrs. Hamlin next door!" Later that afternoon, the students visited Mrs. McNeil in the nurse's office. "We're sorry we squealed so much today," Jessica said. "We didn't mean to make you mad," Peter said. "It's all our fault," Katie cried. "It wasn't anybody's fault," Mrs. McNeil said. "It was an accident. I slipped on some spilled slop. It must have been quite a mess." "We thought you had exploded," Jeremy said. "It was pretty gross," Oscar added. "Maybe you'd better not eat that stuff anymore," Rachel said. "You need to take care of yourself." "It sounds like all of you took care of the problem," Mrs. McNeil said. "Everyone says you knew just what to do when I got hurt." "Only because you're such a good teacher," Jessica said. "And you're such good learners," Mrs. McNeil said. "We still need some practice," Katie said. "We all do when we learn something new," Mrs. McNeil said. "So let's practice. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal." For this story, I want you to think about what they learned, right? In this story, you could probably learn something from these students and this teacher as well. Also, I want you to think about who told this story. Was it Mrs. McNeil? Was it her students? Or maybe was it an outside narrator telling the story. Remember, a narrator is always someone that tells the story, but there's narrators that can be inside a story, narrators that can be outside of the story. If you know, make a comment below.